Right at the memorial gathering for my husband, his children forced me to sign away my rights to the multi-million-dollar Heritage Hotel. I smiled and signed the papers. They happily raised their champagne glasses to celebrate until their lawyer opened the document envelope I had just handed over and dropped his glass onto the pristine white carpet. He stammered, telling them that I had not given them an asset, but rather I had just transferred a massive, insurmountable debt into their names. Stick around until the end to see exactly how I made those greedy individuals dig their own graves. The scent of damp earth and blooming orchids in the family greenhouse was supposed to bring me peace, but today it only served as a suffocating reminder of everything I had just lost. The memorial service for Richard had concluded barely an hour ago. The last of the distinguished guests of Charleston society had offered their hollow condolences and departed the estate, leaving me alone with the silence. I sat on the weathered wooden bench where Richard used to spend his Sunday mornings, meticulously tending to his prized orchids. 18 years of marriage had vanished like vapor in the humid Carolina air. I was 62 years old, a widow whose heart was still raw from watching the man I loved wither away from cancer, and now I was expected to simply erase myself from the legacy we had built together. The heavy glass door of the greenhouse swung open, breaking my fragile solitude. Victoria and Harrison stepped into the humid sanctuary, looking entirely out of place among the delicate flowers. Victoria, at 42, possessed her father's sharp intellect, but absolutely none of his compassion. She wore her grief like one of her exclusive designer accessories, perfectly tailored and entirely superficial. Her black dress was impeccable, her posture rigid, and her gaze swept over me with the cold, calculating assessment of a corporate raider eyeing a vulnerable target. Harrison, 3 years her junior, trailed slightly behind her. At 39, he had always relied on his sister's ruthless momentum to mask his own manipulative greed. He wore a custom dark suit that tried to project authority, but his shifty eyes betrayed his true nature. They had shed their masks of mourning the moment the final guest's car rolled out of the iron gates. "Evelyn," Victoria began, her voice slicing through the heavy, warm air like a scalpel. She did not bother to sit down, preferring to tower over me. "We need to discuss the practical realities of the estate. Now that the pleasantries are over, we have to handle the business side of things." Harrison nodded, stepping forward with the leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "We know this is a difficult afternoon," he added, though his tone was entirely devoid of warmth. "Losing Dad has been a tragedy for all of us, but the legal and financial structures of his properties cannot be put on hold." "A tragedy for all of us." The words tasted like ash in my mouth. Where had they been during the agonizing months of Richard's chemotherapy? Where was this familial solidarity when I was staying awake for 3 days straight, monitoring his pain medication and holding his trembling hand in the dead of night? Victoria had been too busy financing her latest imaginary luxury startup, and Harrison had always claimed his schedule was too packed with important client meetings to visit the hospital for more than 15 minutes a week. Yet here they were, standing before me with the ink on their father's death certificate barely dry, ready to dissect his life's work. "What exactly cannot be put on hold, Victoria?" I asked, keeping my voice remarkably steady despite the cold dread pooling in my stomach. Victoria exchanged a fleeting, knowing glance with Harrison. It was a silent language they had perfected over decades, a shared understanding that entirely excluded me. "The Grand Charleston," she stated flatly, referring to the crown jewel of Richard's real estate portfolio. The Heritage Hotel in the historic district was a masterpiece of classic architecture, valued at an easy $3.5 million. It was a property Richard and I had poured our souls into restoring. Dad's assets, particularly the hotel and this estate, need to be legally secured. We have consulted with our advisors, and we need to clarify the distribution immediately. I gripped the edge of the wooden bench. Richard and I discussed our future extensively. He assured me I would be well taken care of, that I would never have to worry about my home or my security. Well, Dad was always an optimist, Harrison interjected, opening his leather portfolio and extracting a thick stack of intimidating legal documents. He made provisions, certainly, but he perhaps failed to grasp the full complexity of keeping a legacy intact. The core properties, specifically the Grand Charleston and this residential estate, are to be transferred solely to Victoria and myself. Dad always intended for the primary assets to remain within the bloodline. The word bloodline echoed in the glass walls of the greenhouse. It was a deliberate, cruel strike. 18 years of unwavering devotion, of being a faithful wife, a caretaker, and a partner in every sense of the word, were entirely dismissed because I did not share their DNA. "The hotel goes to you both," I whispered, the reality of their demands beginning to crush the breath out of my lungs. "And the house, the home where Richard and I lived for almost 2 decades. "Naturally," Victoria said, her expression entirely unreadable. "It is a family estate, Evelyn. It belongs with the family. But you are not walking away with nothing. There is the life insurance policy. It pays out $150,000. That is a generous sum to help you transition into a new living arrangement suitable for a single woman of your age." $150,000. For a woman who had sacrificed her own career ambitions to manage Richard's household, host his endless charity galas, and serve as his primary nurse through his darkest days. It was a pathetic severance package for a lifetime of love. "I see," I managed to say, my throat tight. "But Richard promised—" "It is strictly business, Evelyn," Harrison cut in smoothly, masking his greed with a veneer of fake sympathy. "And unfortunately, there is another matter that complicates your transition. During Dad's final months, the experimental cancer treatments and the private nursing care accumulated a significant amount of debt. The estate assets are tied up in corporate structures, which means the personal medical bills fall to the surviving spouse." He pulled out another sheet of paper, pushing it toward me. "The outstanding medical debt is approximately $250,000. Since you signed the admission and consent forms at the oncology center, the hospital will be looking directly to you for the settlement." The greenhouse suddenly felt like it was spinning. My mind scrambled to process the horrific mathematics of their demands. They were taking the $3.5 million hotel. They were taking the multi-million-dollar estate. They were leaving me with a life insurance payout of $150,000, but strapping me with a medical debt of $250,000. I would not just be homeless. I would be $100,000 in debt. I would be financially ruined, left to navigate the final chapters of my life in absolute poverty. "You expect me to pay $250,000 in medical debt with a policy that barely covers half of it?" I asked, staring at the 2 people I had tried to love as my own children, "while you inherit millions." "The debts are separate from the inherited real estate," Victoria stated, crossing her arms. "It is unfortunate, but it is how the law works. We cannot drain the hotel's operating capital to pay personal medical expenses. It would ruin the business. However," Harrison added, snapping his portfolio shut, "we are not entirely unreasonable. We understand this is a lot to process. We are willing to give you 45 days to pack your personal belongings and vacate the estate. We feel 45 days is more than enough time for you to find a small apartment and figure out a payment plan with the hospital creditors." 45 days. They were giving me a month and a half to erase 18 years of my existence. They stood there, immaculate and arrogant, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to beg. They expected the grieving widow to dissolve into tears and accept her tragic fate. But as I looked at Victoria's cold eyes and Harrison's smug posture, the crushing despair in my chest began to harden into something entirely different. "I will need some time to review all of this," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous register that neither of them seemed to notice. "Take your 45 days, Evelyn," Victoria said, turning on her designer heels. But the clock starts today. Do not delay on the medical bills. The interest rates are unforgiving. They walked out of the greenhouse without looking back, leaving me alone with the orchids and the ruins of my life. I listened to the crunch of their luxury car tires on the gravel driveway as they drove away, undoubtedly heading to an expensive restaurant to celebrate their newfound empire. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded me, stripping me of my dignity and my future. But as the silence settled back over the damp earth, I realized they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated Richard's brilliant mind, and they had profoundly underestimated the woman he had chosen to spend his life with. I was not dead yet, and I was not going to vanish quietly into the night. The silence that descended upon the estate after Victoria and Harrison finally left was absolute, pressing against my eardrums with the weight of a physical burden. I retreated from the humid embrace of the greenhouse and made my way through the cavernous halls of the Grand Charleston residential estate, the home that was suddenly no longer mine. Every creak of the polished mahogany floorboards, every shadow cast by the antique crystal chandeliers, seemed to mock the 45-day deadline looming over my head. 45 days to erase a lifetime. $250,000 of crushing medical debt. The numbers swirled in my mind like a toxic storm, threatening to pull me under. I found myself standing in the doorway of Richard's private study. This was his inner sanctum, a room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books and smelling faintly of aged bourbon and the distinct crisp scent of his favorite aftershave. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn against the bright South Carolina afternoon sun, casting the room in a perpetual, mournful twilight. I stepped inside and let my fingers trace the edge of his massive oak desk. The leather surface was worn smooth in the exact spots where his arms used to rest, while he reviewed hotel blueprints and financial ledgers. For 18 years, this room had been the beating heart of our shared life, the place where we drank our evening tea and discussed our dreams. Now, it was just a staging ground for my eviction. Despair, cold and sharp, clawed at my chest. I sank into his heavy executive chair, burying my face in my trembling hands. The sheer cruelty of his children's demands was paralyzing. Victoria and Harrison were not just taking my home. They were attempting to strip away my dignity, forcing me to shoulder the financial ruin of Richard's prolonged battle with cancer, while they prepared to liquidate the historic hotel he had loved so dearly. I opened the center drawer of the desk, aimlessly seeking some comfort, some lingering trace of the man who had promised to protect me. The drawer was mostly empty, swept clean of the important corporate documents that Victoria had likely already confiscated during one of her invasive visits while Richard was bedridden. But pushed far back into the darkest corner, hidden beneath a forgotten velvet pen case, my fingers brushed against cold, heavy metal. I pulled it out into the dim light. It was Richard's antique gold pocket watch. My breath caught in my throat. This was not just any piece of jewelry. The engraved timepiece had belonged to Richard's grandfather, and it was his most prized possession. Throughout our entire marriage, I had never seen him without it. It was a permanent fixture in the pocket of his tailored vest, its rhythmic ticking a constant soundtrack to his steady, reassuring presence. Even in the hospital, as his body grew frail, he had kept it on the bedside table, obsessively winding it every single morning. He was a man of absolute precision, a man who believed that time was the most valuable asset one could possess. He would never, under any circumstances, allow his grandfather's watch to wind down and be shoved carelessly into the back of a desk drawer. I held the heavy gold piece in the palm of my hand, feeling a strange prickle of electricity travel up my arm. I pressed the latch, and the intricate golden cover popped open. The watch was dead. The delicate second hand was completely frozen. But what made the hair on the back of my neck stand up was the position of the hands. They had not stopped at a random, unremarkable hour. The short hour hand and the long minute hand were perfectly precisely aligned and halted at exactly 8:14. 8:14. I stared at the unmoving face of the watch, my mind racing. Richard was meticulous. He was a man who planned for every contingency, a man who spoke in deliberate actions rather than empty words. A broken watch in a hidden drawer was not an accident. It was a message. 8:14. Was it a date? August 14th? No, that date held no specific anniversary or significance in our shared history. Was it a time? I closed my eyes, letting the memories of our daily routines wash over me. Richard was a creature of intense habit. Every morning, regardless of the weather or his grueling business schedule, he would wake up at dawn. By 7:30, he had finished his coffee and read the financial papers. And then he would disappear into his sanctuary. Not this dark, wood-paneled office, but his other sanctuary, the greenhouse. He spent precisely 1 hour every morning tending to his rare orchids, a meditative practice he claimed kept his mind sharp for the brutal world of real estate negotiations. A sudden, sharp clarity pierced through my fog of grief. The greenhouse. I stood up so quickly that the heavy oak chair rolled back and slammed into the bookshelves. I clutched the gold pocket watch to my chest and practically ran out of the study, my footsteps echoing loudly down the long, empty hallway. I pushed through the French doors at the back of the house and stepped out onto the stone patio, the humid, thick air of Charleston hitting my face. I hurried back down the gravel path, the stones crunching loudly beneath my shoes, until I reached the glass structure I had fled just an hour ago. Pushing open the heavy door, I was greeted once again by the overwhelming scent of damp earth and exotic blooms. The greenhouse was exactly as I had left it, the wooden bench sitting empty, the rows of purple and white orchids standing in silent witness to the cruel demands Victoria and Harrison had just laid upon me. I walked slowly down the central aisle, my eyes scanning the familiar space. Where would a man who planned everything hide his most important secrets? I approached his primary potting station at the far end of the glass house. It was a heavy, custom-built teak table where he mixed his specific soils and carefully repotted his most delicate specimens. Beneath the table, covering the damp stone floor, was a thick, heavy woven mat that had been there for as long as I had known him. I had always assumed it was there simply to keep his feet dry while he worked. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knelt on the damp stones, ignoring the dirt staining the knees of my black morning dress. I grabbed the edge of the heavy, earth-caked woven mat and pulled it back. There, set perfectly flush with the dark stone floor, was a square panel of brushed steel, a floor safe. I stared at it, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. In 18 years of marriage, in all the hours I had spent sitting on the wooden bench watching him work, I had never known this existed. I brushed the loose soil away from the digital keypad with trembling fingers. The screen remained dark until I pressed my thumb against the wake button. It illuminated with a soft, glowing blue light, waiting for a 4-digit command. I looked down at the heavy gold pocket watch still gripped tightly in my left hand. 8:14. Slowly, deliberately, I reached out and punched the numbers into the keypad. 0, 8, 1, 4. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, a sharp electronic beep echoed in the quiet humidity of the greenhouse, followed by the heavy, satisfying clack of a mechanical deadbolt retracting. The steel handle popped up slightly from its recess. I wrapped my fingers around the cold metal and pulled. The heavy steel door swung upward on silent hinges, revealing a dark cavity beneath the floor. I did not immediately reach inside. Instead, I sat back on my heels, the reality of what was happening washing over me in powerful waves. Richard had known. He had known his children would come for me, and he had spent his final, agonizing months preparing a defense I could not yet comprehend. Through the thick glass walls of the greenhouse, movement caught my eye. I looked up and peered through the hanging ferns. Down the long, winding driveway, Victoria and Harrison's sleek silver sports car was just now reaching the main iron gates. They had lingered on the property, likely inspecting the grounds they believed were already theirs, measuring the estate for their own greedy ambitions. I watched the brake lights flash red as the heavy gates swung open to let them out onto the street. They were leaving to celebrate their victory, confident that they had crushed a weak, grieving widow under the weight of an insurmountable medical debt. They thought they had successfully erased me from Richard's legacy, reducing my 18 years of love to a mere inconvenience managed by a 45-day eviction notice. But as I knelt there in the damp earth, staring down into the open safe my brilliant husband had hidden beneath his orchids, the crushing despair that had paralyzed me all afternoon evaporated. It was replaced by a slow, burning heat spreading outward from my chest. It was the heat of absolute clarity. It was the spark of rebellion. Victoria and Harrison thought they were playing a game of corporate chess with a defenseless opponent. What they did not know, what they could not possibly fathom, was that Richard had already rigged the board, and he had just handed me the winning pieces. I took a deep breath of the humid, flower-scented air, let the broken pocket watch slip into my pocket, and reached down into the dark abyss of the floor safe to see exactly what kind of weapon my husband had left me. Thomas Vance had been Richard's personal attorney and trusted legal counsel for 12 years. In all that time, through countless real estate acquisitions, complex hotel zoning disputes, and intricate corporate negotiations, I had never seen him look as profoundly uncomfortable as he did sitting across from me in his Broad Street office. His usually immaculate composure was visibly fractured, revealing a deeply concerned man beneath the polished, high-powered professional facade. "Evelyn," he said, taking off his tortoiseshell glasses and aggressively rubbing the bridge of his nose for the third time in 10 minutes, "I have to advise you, in the strongest possible terms, that we cannot let this stand. This entire situation is legally and morally grotesque." The warm South Carolina morning sun streamed through the tall, historic windows of his second-floor office, casting the room in sharp, unforgiving relief. Outside, the picturesque streets of downtown Charleston were alive with the sounds of horse-drawn carriage tours and tourists admiring the antebellum architecture. People out there were living normal, rational lives. I deeply envied them. "I understand your concerns, Thomas," I said, my voice sounding much steadier than the violent trembling in my chest suggested. "But Victoria and Harrison have made their position perfectly clear. My mind is nearing a decision." He dropped his glasses onto the mahogany desk and leaned forward, his expression urgent and pleading. "Evelyn, you must fight this. The will they presented to you, there are glaring irregularities. There are massive loopholes regarding the corporate structuring of the Grand Charleston. We could raise serious, valid questions about Richard's mental state during the final months when this alleged revision was drafted. We could contest it, halt the probate process, and force Victoria and Harrison to the negotiating table. They cannot just throw you out on the street." I had spent the entire sleepless night staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, replaying the brutal conversation in the greenhouse, and agonizing over the unyielding mathematics of my new reality. I had tried to reconcile the man I had loved with the cold, clinical legal document that reduced 18 years of devotion to a 45-day eviction notice. "How long would a legal contest take?" I asked quietly, staring at the intricate pattern of his Persian rug. "Months," Thomas admitted, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Possibly years, if they decide to litigate aggressively. But Evelyn, you would have a very real, tangible chance of winning. I know Richard. I drafted his previous estate plans. This will they have produced. It simply does not match the man I knew. The man who spoke about you with such immense respect and deep affection." Respect and affection. Had I simply hallucinated all those quiet evenings on the veranda where Richard held my hand and promised I would never have to worry about my security? Had I completely misunderstood his vows? And during those months or years of litigation, I countered, my voice tight, what exactly am I supposed to live on? Harrison made it abundantly clear that the medical debts are my sole responsibility. $250,000, Thomas? Even if I won a contest eventually, the interest alone on that hospital debt would bankrupt me long before we ever saw the inside of a courtroom. I only have the $150,000 from the life insurance. Thomas's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. Victoria and Harrison are playing dirty. They are using scorched earth tactics. But that is exactly why you cannot give them what they want. They are counting on you being too intimidated, too financially insecure, or simply too exhausted from the grieving process to mount a defense. He was right, of course. Every instinct in my body screamed that this was fundamentally wrong, that Richard had not intended to leave me drowning in debt while his children inherited a multi-million-dollar empire. But instincts did not pay aggressive collection agencies, nor did they put a roof over my head when the 45 days expired. My spirit was shattered. 18 years of sacrificing my own identity to be a wife, a stepmother to children who despised me, and finally, a full-time hospice nurse had left me entirely hollowed out. What if I just gave them everything they want? I asked, the words feeling heavy and metallic on my tongue. Thomas blinked, staring at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. I'm sorry, what? What if I signed whatever papers they need? I continued, the idea solidifying in my mind as a desperate escape hatch. What if I transferred all potential claims to the residential estate and the Grand Charleston and walked away entirely cleanly? How quickly could that be finalized? Evelyn, you cannot be serious, Thomas said, his voice rising in disbelief. You would be voluntarily giving up your legal rights to challenge a $3.5 million asset. You would be walking away from your own home. How quickly, Thomas? I pressed, refusing to break eye contact. He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, his professional mask entirely dissolving to reveal genuine horror. If you waived all claims and signed a comprehensive release of interest, a week. Maybe less if they expedite the filings, but why would you even entertain such a suicidal financial decision? I looked out the window, watching a palmetto tree sway gently in the humid breeze. Because fighting them would destroy whatever is left of me, I said softly. Even if I won the estate, I would be a bitter, exhausted, broke shell of a person by the end of it. Maybe it is better to just accept the injustice and try to build something new with the little time I have left. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with the intense, penetrating focus that made him one of Charleston's most formidable attorneys. Evelyn, in my 25 years of practicing law, I have never had a client voluntarily surrender a multi-million-dollar inheritance to people who are actively trying to ruin them. There has to be something I am missing here. This is surrender. There was something he was missing. I could feel the heavy weight of Richard's gold pocket watch sitting in the bottom of my leather purse. I thought about the brushed steel floor safe hidden beneath the damp earth of the greenhouse. I hadn't opened the documents inside it yet. The shock of finding it had been too raw, and I needed to understand my official legal standing before I delved into Richard's secrets. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was waiting for me. Maybe I am just tired, I said, offering him a sad, weary smile. Tired of fighting for my place in a family that never wanted me. Tired of being viewed as the gold-digging stepmother who wants to steal the children's birthright. Maybe it is just easier to let them have what they firmly believe they deserve. What they believe they deserve, Thomas repeated, his voice sharpening with frustration. Evelyn, this is not about what Victoria and Harrison deserve. This is about what Richard intended. And I am telling you, as his friend and his counsel, this document does not reflect his true wishes. Before I could formulate a response, My phone vibrated sharply against the wood of his desk. It was a text message, the screen illuminated with Victoria's name. Evelyn. Harrison and I have a prospective buyer interested in touring the estate grounds next Tuesday. We would appreciate it if you could confine yourself to the guest wing during the walkthrough. Also, we need to finalize the transfer protocols by Friday. Let's make this smooth. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was almost physically painful. They were already trying to sell the home I was currently sleeping in. They are already planning the transfer and scheduling property tours, I said, turning the phone around so Thomas could read the glowing screen. His face darkened with rage. They are rushing you. It is a classic textbook pressure tactic. Evelyn, I am begging you to reconsider. Take time to grieve. Process what you have lost. Do not make irreversible, catastrophic decisions while you are in the shock of mourning. But the shock was fading. The numbness that had carried me through the funeral was lifting, replaced by a strange, cold pragmatism. I could not fight Victoria and Harrison in a traditional legal battle. They had the resources, the ruthlessness, and the intimate knowledge of Richard's corporate structures. But perhaps I didn't need to fight them directly. If I were to sign the surrender papers, I said slowly, choosing my words with extreme care, what exactly would I be signing away? Thomas sighed heavily, the fight draining out of him as he recognized my stubbornness. All claims to the primary residential estate, the Grand Charleston Hotel, the business assets, and any joint investment accounts. You would retain only the $150,000 life insurance payout and any personal property you owned prior to the marriage. And in exchange, I stated, leaning forward, I want a legally binding clause that they agree to handle the $250,000 medical debt from the estate's corporate funds before any distribution. If I walk away completely clear of those hospital obligations. That was the leverage. It would leave me with the full insurance payout, completely debt-free. It was a fraction of what I was owed, but it was enough to survive. I need to see the exact language, I told him. Thomas opened his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys. I will draft a settlement agreement that protects your remaining interests as aggressively as possible under these absurd circumstances. But Evelyn, once you sign this release, there is absolutely no going back. You will have no legal recourse whatsoever if you later discover information that would have changed your decision. I understand, I said, but as I said it, I wondered if I truly did. My hand drifted to my purse, my fingers brushing against the cool leather just outside where the pocket watch rested. I was making a monumental concession, handing them the keys to the kingdom. But tonight, I would return to the greenhouse. Tonight, I would open that steel safe and finally understand what Richard had left behind in the dark. The antique grandfather clock in the grand foyer of the estate chimed 3 times, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo endlessly through the empty, cavernous hallways. I sat in the formal sitting room, surrounded by velvet upholstery and imported silk drapes, watching my smartphone light up on the polished mahogany coffee table. It was vibrating continuously, a relentless, mechanical buzzing that grated against my frayed nerves. It was Victoria again. The name flashed on the screen, accompanied by yet another notification bubble. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the device, unlocking the screen to reveal a barrage of text messages that had been arriving steadily since I left Thomas Vance's office earlier that afternoon. Evelyn, darling. The latest message read, the false endearment dripping with a sickly sweet toxicity. The Charleston Historical Preservation Society needs the new ownership filings for the Grand Charleston by the end of the week. Let's bypass the lengthy, painful probate process and sign the waivers tomorrow. It is exactly what Dad would have wanted. We just want to ensure you are not burdened with hotel administration or corporate legalities while you grieve. Let us handle the heavy lifting. I swiped down, revealing an email from Harrison that had arrived just 20 minutes prior. His approach was less subtle, cloaking a sharp threat within the guise of financial advice. Evelyn, just following up on our discussion regarding the $250,000 in outstanding medical liens. Victoria and I have spoken with our financial advisors. If you sign the property transfer waivers by Friday morning, we are willing to personally guarantee that the corporate estate will absorb and clear the hospital bills in their entirety. However, if you choose to delay or contest the transfer, the hospital's collection agency will have no choice but to petition to freeze your personal bank accounts, including the life insurance payout. We want to avoid that public embarrassment for you. Please confirm your cooperation by this evening. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the messages over and over until the harsh blue light made my eyes ache. They were deploying a classic synchronized psychological assault. Victoria played the role of the concerned, dutiful daughter trying to spare me from administrative burdens, while Harrison brandished the crushing weight of a $250,000 debt like a weapon, ready to strike if I dared to step out of line. But as I sat there in the heavy, humid silence of the Charleston afternoon, the initial panic that had gripped my chest began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I had spent 18 years navigating the treacherous social waters of this family. I knew how Victoria and Harrison operated. They were arrogant, yes, but they were also profoundly lazy when it came to genuine work. They relied on Richard's brilliant infrastructure to fund their lavish lifestyles. In the notoriously slow, tradition-bound world of Charleston high society, estate transfers involving historic properties like the Grand Charleston were agonizingly deliberate. They involved endless red tape, Preservation Society approvals, and meticulous corporate audits. Normally, Victoria and Harrison would have thrived in that bureaucratic theater, using the prolonged probate to host meetings, network with local politicians, and preen as the heirs apparent to Richard's empire. So why the sudden, breathless rush? Why the desperate need to finalize the transfer of a $3.5 million hotel by Friday morning? The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. They were terrified. Beneath their polished designer suits and their arrogant ultimatums, Victoria and Harrison were vibrating with a hidden, desperate panic. They were rushing the paperwork not because they were efficient, but because they were afraid of what might happen if the estate remained under a microscope for too long. They needed my signature to lock the doors, seal the corporate vaults, and finalize the transition before I, or Thomas Vance, or anyone else, had a chance to look too closely at the numbers. They were dangling the $250,000 debt relief, not as a generous favor, but as a desperate bribe to blindfold me. They thought I was weak. They believed my grief had made me malleable and foolish. And in that moment, I realized exactly how I was going to survive this nightmare. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to feed their monumental arrogance until they choked on it. I picked up the phone, bypassed their messages entirely, and dialed Thomas Vance's direct office line. He answered on the second ring. "Evelyn," his voice came through the receiver, heavy with concern. "Please tell me you are calling to authorize a litigation hold. I have the preliminary injunction papers sitting on my desk right now. We can file them with the county clerk before the courthouse closes." "No, Thomas," I said, my voice steady, stripped of the trembling uncertainty that had plagued me earlier. "I am not calling to authorize a fight. I am calling to finalize my surrender." There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him gripping the edge of his desk. "Evelyn, we discussed this. It is a catastrophic mistake. You are handing them a $3.5 million heritage hotel and a multi-million-dollar residential estate for absolutely nothing." "Not for nothing," I corrected him smoothly. "I am trading it for the illusion of their security." "Thomas, I need you to draft the surrender agreement exactly as we discussed, but I need the language to be ironclad regarding the medical debt. Make it absolute." Thomas exhaled sharply, a sound of pure frustration. "Explain this to me, please." Help me understand why you are throwing away your future. Because they are rushing, Thomas, I explained, keeping my voice low, intensely aware of the empty house around me. They are sending me texts and emails every half hour. They are threatening to freeze my accounts by Friday. People who possess a legally sound, unassailable, will do not panic. They do not need to bribe a grieving widow with debt relief if they already hold all the cards. They are terrified that if I fight, the discovery process will uncover something they want kept buried. They want me gone, and they want it done quietly. And your solution is to grant their wish? Thomas asked, skepticism radiating through the phone. My solution is to lull them into a false sense of absolute victory, I said. If I fight them now, they will raise their shields. They will bring in an army of corporate litigators, and they will grind me into dust with legal fees before I ever see a courtroom. But if I capitulate, if I play the role of the broken, terrified widow who just wants to run away from the debt, they will drop their guard entirely. They will sign the assumption of the medical debt without a second thought because they believe they are buying a $3.5 million hotel for the bargain price of $250,000. I paused, looking out of the window toward the glass roof of the greenhouse, reflecting the late afternoon sun. Draft the papers, Thomas. Make it official. I, Evelyn, hereby renounce any and all claims, present and future, to the Grand Charleston Hotel and the family residential estate. I surrender all corporate voting rights and executive privileges associated with Richard's holdings. In exchange, Victoria and Harrison jointly and severally assume full, unconditional liability for the $250,000 in outstanding medical expenses, leaving my $150,000 life insurance policy entirely untouched and unencumbered. I could hear the frantic scratching of his pen against a legal pad. It goes against every fiber of my being as an attorney to draft this document, Evelyn. It is financial suicide. It is a tactical retreat, I assured him. Have the draft ready to send to their lawyers by tomorrow morning. Make it look like you tried to talk me out of it, but I was simply too hysterical and desperate to listen. Let them think they broke me. And then what? Thomas asked quietly. You take your $150,000 and just disappear? Then, I said, my fingers subconsciously brushing against the fabric of my pocket where Richard's frozen gold watch rested, we see what happens when the dust settles. I hung up the phone before he could ask any more questions. The house was quiet again, the relentless buzzing of the phone finally silenced by my definitive action. I had just initiated a legal process that would strip me of millions of dollars in real estate and hand the keys of Richard's empire to the two people who despised me most, to the outside world, to Thomas Vance, and especially to Victoria and Harrison. It looked like the ultimate pathetic surrender. But as the South Carolina sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns of the estate, a profound sense of calm washed over me. I had set the trap. By giving them the grand prize they so desperately coveted, I had ensured they would not be looking over their shoulders. They would be too busy measuring the hotel for new drapes and planning their victory parties to notice a grieving widow taking a quiet midnight stroll through the gardens. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water, watching the sky turn from a bruised purple to an inky black. The 45-day eviction clock was ticking, but it no longer felt like a countdown to my destruction. It felt like a countdown to a revelation. I set the glass down on the marble counter and turned my gaze toward the French doors. It was time. The estate was asleep, the lawyers were pacified, and the greedy heirs were dreaming of their impending wealth. It was time to go back to the greenhouse, input the code from the broken gold watch, and open the brushed steel safe. It was time to find out exactly what kind of war Richard had prepared me to fight. The midnight air in Charleston was heavy, clinging to my skin like a damp, suffocating cloak as I slipped out of the back doors of the residential estate. The sprawling grounds were cloaked in an impenetrable darkness, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the weeping branches of the ancient live oaks and the swaying silhouettes of Spanish moss. The house behind me was dead silent. The staff had retired to their quarters hours ago, and I had waited until 2 a.m. to ensure absolutely no one would interrupt me. I moved with deliberate, silent steps across the crushed gravel path, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was officially a woman who had surrendered. To the outside world, and certainly to Victoria and Harrison, I was the defeated, terrified widow who had practically begged Thomas Vance to sign away a $3.5 million heritage hotel just to escape a fabricated medical debt. But as I approached the glass walls of the greenhouse, the crushing weight of my impending 45-day eviction felt strangely distant. I was no longer running from my reality. I was finally stepping into the labyrinth Richard had meticulously designed for me. The heavy glass door opened with a soft, familiar sigh. The scent of damp earth, fertilizer, and blooming orchids immediately enveloped me, a ghostly reminder of the man who had spent thousands of hours in this very spot. I did not turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I relied on the small, focused beam of a brass flashlight I had taken from the kitchen drawer. I navigated down the central aisle, the shadows of the exotic plants dancing wildly against the glass panes, until I reached his heavy teak potting station. I set the flashlight down, its beam casting a sharp circle of light on the dark stone floor. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the damp chill seeping through my clothes, and grabbed the edge of the heavy woven mat. I pulled it back, exposing the brushed steel square of the floor safe. My fingers were trembling slightly as I reached out to the digital keypad. I pressed the wake button, watching the soft blue light illuminate the darkness of the greenhouse. I did not need to look at the broken gold pocket watch resting safely in my pocket. The numbers were already seared into my brain. 0, 8, 1, 4. The electronic beep sliced through the silence, followed by the heavy mechanical thud of the internal deadbolt retracting. I hooked my fingers under the recessed steel handle and pulled the heavy door upward on its silent hinges. I pointed the flashlight down into the cavity. I had subconsciously expected to find stacks of emergency cash, perhaps a collection of rare bearer bonds, or a traditional sealed legal will waiting to be delivered to Thomas Vance. I expected a conventional safety net. But Richard, as always, defied convention. There was no money. Instead, the small vault was neatly packed with items that looked entirely ordinary, but pulsed with an undeniable gravity. I reached down and carefully extracted the contents one by one, laying them out on the damp woven mat. First were 3 thick, black-bound accounting ledgers, their leather covers worn soft from frequent handling. Second was a heavy, oversized manila envelope. It was sealed shut with thick strips of security tape, and across the front, in Richard's elegant, precise cursive, was a single word, Evelyn. Finally, sitting at the very bottom of the safe, was a small, sleek silver USB drive, heavy and cold to the touch. I sat back on my heels, staring at the objects bathed in the circle of the flashlight. A profound sense of anticipation, mixed with a creeping dread, washed over me. This was not a severance package. This was a war chest. I gathered the heavy ledgers, the sealed envelope, and the metallic drive, clutching them tightly to my chest. I closed the heavy steel door of the safe, ensuring it locked with a solid click, and rolled the woven mat back into its perfect original position. I hurried back across the dark lawns, slipping back into the silent mansion like a thief in my own home. I bypassed the grand staircase and moved directly down the main hallway toward Richard's private study. I stepped inside, securely locking the heavy mahogany doors behind me, and drew the thick velvet curtains tightly shut before turning on the green glass banker's lamp on his desk. I arranged the items on the leather blotter where he used to sign his multi-million-dollar contracts. The black ledgers smelled faintly of old paper and the distinct metallic scent of fresh ink. The sealed envelope beckoned to me, but something told me to wait, that the physical letter was the final piece of the puzzle, meant to be read only after I understood the full scope of the battlefield. My eyes locked onto the sleek silver USB drive. I reached over and pressed the power button on Richard's massive desktop iMac. The machine hummed to life, the bright screen cutting through the dim light of the study. I picked up the USB drive and inserted it into the port at the back of the monitor. Immediately, a security prompt flashed onto the center of the screen. Encrypted volume, password required. Richard had never trusted cloud storage or external servers with his most sensitive information. If he was hiding something digital, he locked it down with military-grade encryption. I stared at the blinking cursor in the password field. I thought of our wedding anniversary, his birthday, the incorporation date of the Grand Charleston. I tried them all, and each time the screen flashed a harsh red access denied. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, rubbing my temples. He wanted me to find this. He had intentionally left the broken grandfather's watch in the center drawer for me to discover. The time on the watch, 0814, was the combination to the physical floor safe. But what was the digital key? I pulled the heavy gold pocket watch from my pocket and set it on the desk beside the keyboard. I stared at the frozen hands, perfectly aligned at the 8 and just past the 2. 8:14. In military time, 8:14 in the morning was simply 0814. But what about the evening? My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed the numbers slowly, deliberately. 2, 0, 1, 4, 2014. I pressed the return key. The security prompt vanished, replaced by the satisfying chime of the computer mounting an external drive. The screen populated with a beautifully organized, meticulously structured directory of folders. I leaned in, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my widened eyes. The main directory was titled, simply, Investigation Archive. I clicked on the master folder, my pulse pounding relentlessly in my ears. Inside were dozens of subfolders, audio files, and scanned PDF documents. But it was the timestamps on the files that made the blood freeze in my veins. Every single document, every photograph, every financial spreadsheet had been created and compiled exactly 7 months ago. 7 months ago. That was the precise month Richard had received his terminal cancer diagnosis. While I had been weeping in the sterile offices of the oncology ward, desperately researching experimental treatments and trying to hold my fracturing world together, my husband had quietly, ruthlessly hired a team to investigate his own family. I opened the first subfolder, titled Victoria, Current Liabilities. The screen instantly filled with scanned documents bearing the letterhead of a highly exclusive, notoriously discreet private investigation firm based out of Atlanta. There were pages upon pages of surveillance logs, wire transfer receipts, and forensic accounting reports. It was not a simple background check. It was a total, unsparing autopsy of his daughter's life. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of the investigator's summary. I saw mentions of shell companies, offshore accounts, and staggering, incomprehensible deficits. I saw surveillance photographs of Victoria meeting with aggressive private lenders in shadowy hotel lobbies, her designer facade stripping away to reveal a desperate, cornered woman. I backed out of the folder and clicked on the next one, Harrison, Regulatory Violations. Again, a mountain of undeniable, catastrophic evidence flooded the screen. I saw copies of altered client contracts, hidden ledgers from his supposed wealth management firm, and communications that clearly outlined deliberate, systematic fraud. I sat paralyzed in Richard's chair, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal washing over me like a tidal wave. They had not just been waiting for him to die to claim their inheritance. They had been actively drowning in their own illicit secrets, circling his declining health like vultures, desperate for his estate to cover their massive illegal shortfalls. They needed the Grand Charleston not to preserve his legacy, but to liquidate it immediately to save themselves from federal prison. I reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the heavy, sealed manila envelope with my name written on it. The private investigator's files were the ammunition, but this envelope, I realized with absolute certainty, contained the weapon itself. I took a deep breath, the silence of the Charleston estate pressing in around me, and broke the heavy seal. The heavy manila envelope tore open with a sharp, agonizing sound that felt deafening in the absolute silence of Richard's mahogany-paneled study. My hands, which had been trembling just hours ago under the weight of Victoria and Harrison's cruel demands in the greenhouse, were now perfectly steady. I slid the thick stack of papers onto the leather blotter, directly under the sharp, focused pool of light from the green glass banker's lamp. I had spent 18 years believing that Richard's children simply resented my presence, that their coldness was born from a misguided, stubborn loyalty to their late mother. But as I began to read the meticulously organized reports compiled by the Atlanta-based private investigation firm, that naive illusion shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Their cruelty was not born of grief, nor was it born of familial loyalty. It was born of sheer, unadulterated desperation and staggering criminal liability. The first dossier was dedicated entirely to Victoria. I turned the crisp pages, my eyes scanning the dense columns of forensic accounting summaries, bank wire transfers, and surveillance logs. For years, Victoria had paraded around Charleston society as a brilliant, independent entrepreneur. She constantly flaunted her supposed wealth with custom designer wardrobes, exclusive country club memberships, and a lavish downtown penthouse. The truth, laid bare in stark black ink by the investigators, was utterly pathetic. She was a fraud. She had systematically siphoned funds from the secondary corporate accounts Richard had foolishly trusted her to manage, funneling the money into a phantom luxury startup. She claimed it was an elite concierge service for international billionaires, but it existed entirely on paper. There were no actual clients, no real infrastructure, and no revenue. It was just a catastrophic drain of resources used to fund her extravagant lifestyle. When the diverted corporate funds inevitably ran dry, she had turned to aggressive, unregulated private lenders in the financial shadows of Atlanta and Miami. The final, damning summary page highlighted her total outstanding liabilities. Victoria was drowning in $400,000 of high-interest debt. The creditors were closing in, threatening to expose her fraudulent startup to the authorities and ruin her social standing permanently. That was exactly why she needed the Grand Charleston so desperately, and why she was trying to force the transfer in a matter of days. She didn't want to preserve her father's architectural legacy. She needed to liquidate a $3.5 million heritage property immediately to save herself from complete financial ruin. I pictured her standing in the greenhouse that afternoon, her fake designer morning dress draping her frame, demanding I vacate my home in 45 days, and smugly offering me a meager $150,000, all while she was hiding a $400,000 hole of her own making. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of it made my stomach churn with disgust. I pushed Victoria's file aside and pulled the second dossier into the light. Harrison's file was even thicker, the financial webs more complex, and his crime significantly more severe. Harrison had always presented himself as the polished, conservative wealth manager, the steady hand guiding elite client portfolios through turbulent markets. He had looked down his nose at me for 18 years, treating me as a financial illiterate who simply spent his father's money. The investigator's report painted a terrifyingly different picture. Harrison was not merely in debt like his sister. He was actively running a sophisticated embezzlement ring. He had been systematically skimming from his wealthiest, most elderly, and most vulnerable clients. The documents contained copies of forged signatures, altered client contracts, and hidden ledgers that proved he was diverting assets to offshore shell companies to cover a string of disastrous, highly leveraged personal investments. Furthermore, the private investigators had uncovered a systematic tax evasion scheme that Harrison had been operating for nearly 5 years. The total sum of his fraud and tax liabilities amounted to a staggering $500,000. He wasn't just facing bankruptcy and social exile. Harrison was staring down the barrel of a multi-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The moment his clients requested an independent audit, or the IRS noticed the glaring discrepancies in his shell companies, his life as a Charleston elite would be entirely over. The urgency in his voice earlier, the thinly veiled threats about freezing my bank accounts over the $250,000 medical debt, it was all a massive projection of his own absolute terror. They were cornered animals, perfectly willing to tear apart a grieving widow to save their own skins. And Richard knew. He knew absolutely everything. Tucked carefully between the financial autopsies was a smaller, blue-tinted folder containing medical records. I opened it, expecting to find more details about his grueling oncology treatments, but the letterhead belonged to a highly regarded independent neurologist based in Atlanta. It was a comprehensive cognitive assessment, dated just 6 weeks before his death, during a period when his physical body was failing rapidly. The medical summary was concise, legally binding, and undeniable. Patient exhibits 0 signs of cognitive decline, dementia, or medication-induced impairment. Mental faculties remain exceptionally sharp. Analytical capabilities are entirely intact, and decision-making capacity is optimal. Victoria and Harrison had been whispering to Thomas Vance, the hospital staff, and anyone in our social circle who would listen, that Richard's mind was slipping. They had been aggressively laying the groundwork to contest any decisions he made that did not directly benefit them. But this hidden report was a titanium shield. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that every single move Richard made in his final months, every signature he penned, every hidden safe he installed, was executed with total, lethal clarity. He had laid in his hospice bed, enduring the agonizing pain of his illness, and watched his children hover around him, faking their tears, while he knew they were thieves waiting to pick his bones clean. My breathing grew shallow as I reached the very bottom of the envelope. There was one final document bound in a dark blue cover that denoted international corporate banking. I opened it, and the numbers printed on the crisp page were so staggering I had to read them 3 times, tracing my finger beneath the zeros to ensure I was not hallucinating. Throughout our marriage, I had known Richard was a wealthy man, but his net worth had always been tied up in the physical real estate of the Grand Charleston, our residential estate, and various local commercial properties. At least, that was the financial narrative he had carefully maintained for his children. The document trembling in my hands was a consolidated bank statement from an elite, highly secure offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands. Over the past 7 months, as soon as the private investigators revealed the depth of his children's betrayal, Richard had quietly, methodically liquidated a massive network of secondary assets. He had sold off stock portfolios, private equity holdings, and minor commercial properties across state lines that Victoria and Harrison knew absolutely nothing about. He had funneled every single penny of that liquid wealth into this impregnable offshore trust account. The bottom line of the statement glowed against the stark white paper in the dim light of the study: $6,200,000 in liquid cash. $6,200,000. It was a staggering fortune, completely divorced from the estate currently undergoing probate in South Carolina. It was a ghost account, entirely untouchable by Victoria's aggressive creditors, Harrison's defrauded clients, or the relentless hospital billing departments. And beneath that massive sum was the legal naming document for the trust. There were no complex stipulations, no corporate boards to answer to, and no shared beneficiaries. There was only one name listed as the absolute sole beneficiary, with immediate, unrestricted access upon the presentation of Richard's death certificate. Evelyn. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the silence of the massive house pressing against my eardrums. I was not a destitute widow facing $250,000 medical debt. I was a woman with a secret, untraceable fortune of over $6 million. Richard had not abandoned me to the wolves. He had secretly armed me, funded me, and positioned me perfectly to survive the impending storm. He had given me the financial power to live the rest of my life in absolute, unbothered luxury, far away from the toxic reach of his children. But as I looked back down at the dark, damning ledgers detailing the crimes of Victoria and Harrison, I knew this was about much more than just my personal survival. Richard had not just given me an escape route. He had given me the tools to execute his final judgment. The 45-day eviction clock was still ticking loudly in my mind, but the paradigm had shifted entirely. It was no longer my countdown to ruin. It was theirs. The deep, enveloping silence of Richard's mahogany-paneled study felt different now. It was no longer a tomb of memories, but a war room. The damning dossiers of Victoria and Harrison's financial crimes and the staggering offshore bank statement lay spread across the leather blotter, illuminated by the harsh, concentrated beam of the green glass banker's lamp. Yet, tucked at the very bottom of the heavy manila envelope, resting beneath the cold, hard data of betrayal and hidden wealth, were two final items. One was a thick document bound in heavy, official blue paper. The other was a simple, sealed envelope made of premium cream-colored stationery. Across the front, written in a hand that was slightly shaky but unmistakably resolute, was my name. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from a profound, overwhelming reverence as I broke the wax seal. I unfolded the heavy paper. Seeing Richard's elegant, precise cursive ink spread across the page brought a sudden, violent lump to my throat. It was as if he were sitting right there in the leather chair opposite me, his voice echoing in the quiet room, reaching out from beyond the grave to guide me through the darkness. My dearest Evelyn, the letter began, the ink pressing deeply into the paper. If you are reading this, then the worst has come to pass. I am gone, and my children have inevitably shown you their true, venomous colors. I am so deeply sorry that I could not tell you about any of this while I was still alive. I wanted to spare you the agony of knowing how thoroughly my own flesh and blood had corrupted themselves. But as my body began to fail, my eyes were finally opened. I watched Victoria and Harrison hover around my hospice bed, projecting their false grief while their eyes darted around the room, calculating the value of the antique furniture. I knew they were drowning in their own illicit debts, and I knew with absolute certainty that the moment my heart stopped beating, they would try to strip you of your dignity, your home, and your future. I could not, and would not, allow the woman who gave me 18 years of unconditional love to be thrown to the wolves. I traced the curves of his handwriting, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes and dropping silently onto the leather desk pad. He had known. Through the fog of morphine and the agony of his failing organs, his primary concern had been my survival. They believe they are fighting for an empire, Evelyn. The letter continued, the tone shifting from tender to ruthlessly pragmatic. They look at the Grand Charleston and they see their salvation. I know they have demanded the hotel. I know they look at its majestic antebellum facade, the sweeping marble staircases, and the massive cascading crystal chandeliers in the main ballroom, and they salivate. They see a pristine monument of Charleston high society, a $3.5 million crown jewel that will instantly wipe away their secret debts and elevate them to the pinnacle of wealth. I closed my eyes, the image of the Grand Charleston blooming vividly in my mind, The visual was breathtaking. It was a masterpiece of Southern architecture. The grand lobby, lined with imported Italian marble and rich velvet drapery, always smelled of fresh lilies and expensive floor wax. The breathtaking crystal chandeliers, each weighing over a ton, hung from the vaulted ceilings like frozen, glittering rain, casting fractured rainbows across the pristine walls. It was the ultimate symbol of opulence, success, and impenetrable financial stability. That magnificent, sparkling vision was exactly what Victoria and Harrison thought they were bullying me into surrendering. They wanted the chandeliers. They wanted the marble. But it is an illusion, Evelyn, Richard's letter revealed, the words striking like a physical blow. It is a magnificent, glittering, empty shell. When the private investigators uncovered the depth of Victoria's fraudulent startup debts and Harrison's terrifying federal tax evasion and embezzlement schemes, I realized I had to protect my life's work from being liquidated to pay off criminals. 7 months ago, using a network of out-of-state commercial lenders who operate far outside of Thomas Vance's purview, I quietly and aggressively leveraged everything. I took out maximum commercial mortgages against the entire physical structure of the Grand Charleston, as well as this residential estate. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer to the lamplight, my eyes devouring the next paragraph. I bled the properties entirely dry. I pulled exactly $4.5 million in cash out of the hotel and the house. That capital, along with the liquidated secondary assets, is the $6.2 million sitting safely in the Cayman Trust in your name. The properties they are so desperate to snatch from your hands are structurally toxic. They are carrying $4.5 million in high-interest debt, and the balloon payments are rapidly approaching default. The banks are already preparing their preliminary foreclosure notices. The sheer, terrifying genius of the trap hit me with the force of a freight train. Victoria and Harrison were not fighting for an asset. They were fighting for an anchor that would drag them straight to the bottom of the ocean. The debts were legally tethered to the deeds of the properties. Whoever held the title held the liability. They think they are inheriting a gold mine, Richard wrote, his words practically vibrating with a cold, calculated justice. But if they take the deeds, they trigger the debt assumption clauses. They will instantly owe the banks $4.5 million. Given Victoria's hidden loans and Harrison's fraudulent ledgers, their personal credit is a house of cards. No reputable financial institution will ever refinance those commercial mortgages for them. When the balloon payments hit next month, the banks will foreclose, seize the hotel, seize the estate, and then aggressively pursue Victoria and Harrison's personal assets to cover the massive deficiency balance. It will bankrupt them, expose their existing frauds to federal scrutiny, and ruin them permanently. I set the letter down, my hands shaking so violently I had to press them flat against the cold wood of the desk. I looked at the heavy, blue-bound document sitting next to the envelope. It was Richard's true, legally binding last will and testament. It had not been drafted by Thomas Vance, whom Richard clearly realized was too closely aligned with Harrison's social circles. It had been drafted by someone else, a shadow attorney kept entirely off the family books. I opened the blue cover and read through the thick legal jargon. The terms were beautifully, devastatingly simple. Richard revoked all previous wills and codicils. He left absolutely every asset, every corporate entity, every dollar, and every piece of real estate exclusively to his beloved wife, Evelyn. Victoria and Harrison were legally entitled to nothing but their own childhood memories, but it was the final clause, highlighted on the last page, that truly revealed the depth of Richard's trust in me. It was the mechanism of execution. I leave the ultimate disposition of my primary physical real estate, specifically the Grand Charleston Hotel and the family residential estate, entirely in the hands of my wife, Evelyn. I grant her the absolute, unchallengeable legal authority to gift, transfer, or deed these specific properties to my children, Victoria and Harrison, should she, in her infinite wisdom and intimate knowledge of their character, deem them worthy of receiving such a legacy. Richard had not pulled the trigger himself. He had loaded the weapon, aimed it flawlessly, and then handed it to me. He had empowered me with the ultimate choice. I could keep the heavily mortgaged properties, use my offshore millions to quietly pay off the loans, and banish his children with nothing. Or I could give them exactly what they had demanded in the greenhouse. I could play the role of the defeated, generous widow and legally bestow upon them the glittering chandeliers, the marble floors, and the crushing $4.5 million guillotine hovering just inches above their arrogant heads. I sat back in the leather chair, staring into the dark corners of the study. The image of Victoria sneering at me, giving me 45 days to pack up 18 years of my life, burned brightly in my mind. I remembered Harrison's smug, venomous tone as he tried to weaponize Richard's cancer treatments, demanding I shoulder a $250,000 medical debt while they inherited millions. They had tried to destroy me without a second thought. They had viewed my grief as a weakness to be exploited. I carefully folded Richard's letter and placed it back into the cream-colored envelope, tucking it safely into my purse alongside the broken gold pocket watch. The crushing despair that had paralyzed me all afternoon was completely gone, incinerated by the cold, brilliant fire of Richard's final act of love. I looked at the blue-bound will and smiled in the empty room. Victoria and Harrison wanted the Grand Charleston. They wanted the prestige, the crystal, and the legacy. They had begged for it, threatened me for it, and manipulated the legal system for it. I decided, right then and there, in the dead of night, that it would be incredibly rude of me to deny them their heart's desire. I was going to give them the hotel. I was going to give them the estate. I was going to hand them the glittering, empty shell, and then I was going to watch them drown in it. Victoria's downtown Charleston penthouse was a towering monument to borrowed money and absolute vanity. As the private elevator doors slid open directly into her expansive foyer, I was immediately greeted by the stark, modern opulence she so desperately craved. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Charleston Harbor and the Ravenel Bridge, while the interior was a curated gallery of imported Italian marble, minimalist designer furniture, and abstract art pieces that likely cost more than a standard family home. To the untrained eye, it was a flawless projection of immense success and generational wealth. But walking across the polished stone floors, armed with the knowledge of her $400,000 fraudulent debt and her impending financial collapse, the entire penthouse felt like a beautifully decorated film set, fragile enough to be blown away by a stiff breeze. Victoria emerged from the open-concept kitchen, holding a crystal wine glass and wearing a silk evening gown that seemed entirely too formal for a simple family dinner. At 42, she had perfected the art of looking expensively maintained, but tonight I noticed the subtle tension around her eyes, the rigid set of her jaw. "Evelyn, darling," she cooed, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. She leaned in for an air kiss that barely grazed my cheek, a performative gesture devoid of any actual warmth. "I am so glad you decided to come. We thought it would be nice to have a quiet, intimate dinner together before we finalize all the heavy, boring legal matters tomorrow." "Thank you for having me, Victoria," I replied, keeping my voice soft and deliberately weary. I wore a simple, unadorned black dress, slouching my shoulders slightly to project the exact image they expected: a defeated, exhausted widow who had finally given up the fight. The estate has been so painfully quiet since Richard passed. Harrison was already lounging in the sprawling living area, nursing a generous pour of amber liquid in a heavy crystal tumbler. The scotch he was drinking undoubtedly cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. The room was designed to project an aura of effortless dominance, But knowing what I now knew about his $500,000 embezzlement scheme and his looming federal tax evasion charges, his arrogant posture looked utterly pathetic. "Evelyn," Harrison said, standing up to offer a curt nod, "you are looking well, considering the circumstances. I spoke with Thomas Vance this afternoon. He mentioned you have been incredibly cooperative regarding the waiver drafts for the Grand Charleston. I want to personally thank you for choosing family harmony over a drawn-out, pointless legal battle." Family harmony. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the phrase almost made me smile. "I simply want peace, Harrison," I murmured, taking a seat on the edge of a stark white leather sofa. Richard always despised conflict. I realized that clinging to a hotel and an estate I cannot possibly manage on my own is not what he would have wanted. And of course, your generous offer to handle the $250,000 medical debt was a significant relief to my mind. The relief that washed over Harrison's face was palpable, a visible relaxing of the tight muscles in his neck. "It is the least we can do, Evelyn, truly. We want to ensure you are unburdened." Victoria's private chef served dinner in the formal dining room, a space dominated by a massive single-slab marble table that could easily seat 12. Tonight, however, it was just the three of us, spread out beneath a modern geometric chandelier. The food was exquisite. Pan-seared scallops over a bed of saffron risotto, paired perfectly with a chilled, devastatingly expensive Chardonnay. As they ate, Victoria and Harrison moved around me with the practiced grace of predators who believed they had already cornered their prey and were simply enjoying the final moments before the kill. As the main course progressed, they could not help themselves. Their arrogance bled into the conversation. They began discussing their grand plans for the Grand Charleston, practically spending their unearned inheritance right in front of me. "The first thing we need to do is completely overhaul the lobby," Victoria declared, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "Those antique crystal chandeliers are so incredibly dated. We need something sleeker, more contemporary, and we will absolutely need to restructure the management team. The current staff is far too loyal to the old way of doing things." "Agreed," Harrison chimed in, slicing into his scallops. "Once the deed transfer is finalized on Friday, we can leverage the hotel's equity to expand the brand. Dad kept the capital tied up in tradition for far too long. It is time to modernize the portfolio." I took a slow, deliberate bite of my risotto, letting them build their castles in the sky. I let them envision the millions they thought they were about to secure. I waited until the conversation hit a natural lull, until the only sound in the room was the soft clinking of silver against fine china, before I softly cleared my throat. "Speaking of Richard's paperwork," I began, my tone perfectly conversational, entirely innocent, "I was actually doing some packing in his private study today. It is quite overwhelming, to be honest. He kept so many documents I simply do not understand." The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop several degrees. Harrison set his fork down, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What kind of documents, Evelyn?" "Oh, just endless corporate files and financial statements," I sighed, waving my hand dismissively as if the mere thought of them bored me. "Though I did find something rather peculiar out in the greenhouse. Did either of you know Richard had a floor safe hidden beneath his potting station?" The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and violently tense. Victoria's hand froze halfway to her mouth, her wine glass hovering in midair. Harrison went perfectly still, his eyes locked onto my face with a sudden, feral intensity. "A floor safe," Victoria repeated, her voice tightly controlled, though a slight tremor betrayed her panic. "No. Dad never mentioned a safe in the greenhouse. What was inside it?" "Just more paperwork, mostly," I said cheerfully, taking another sip of my water, "and a strange silver USB drive. I am so terribly bad with technology, but I managed to plug it into his computer. It was full of these dense, heavily redacted reports from an investigation firm in Atlanta. Have either of you ever heard of them?" The color drained entirely from Harrison's face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. A distinct sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. The private investigation files, the irrefutable proof of his embezzlement and her fraudulent loans. They both knew instantly what those reports contained. "Evelyn," Harrison said, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it into a lower, commanding register. "Those types of corporate audits are highly confidential. You really shouldn't be looking through them without a legal background. It is easy to misinterpret raw financial data." "You are probably right," I agreed warmly, offering him a compliant smile. I couldn't make heads or tails of most of it, but there was one physical document that caught my eye. A very thick, official-looking contract from a commercial lending group. It detailed a rather large mortgage, $4.5 million, I believe, taken out against the deed of the Grand Charleston just a few months ago. Clatter. Victoria's heavy silver fork slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting her porcelain plate with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. She stared at me, her eyes wide, her perfectly manicured facade completely shattering. A $4.5 million loan?" she whispered, the air rushing out of her lungs. "Against the hotel?" "Yes, and against the residential estate as well, from what I could gather," I continued, adopting a look of mild, matronly confusion. It seemed to indicate that the properties are heavily indebted and the balloon payments are due next month. "But as you said, Harrison, I am just a widow without a business degree. Legal documents are so dreadfully confusing to me." Harrison swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing convulsively. He looked at Victoria, and the silent communication that passed between them was no longer one of shared arrogance, but of absolute, unadulterated terror. The realization was crashing down upon them in real time. The $3.5 million asset they were rushing to steal was actually a $4.5 million anchor. "In fact," I said, dabbing the corners of my mouth with my linen napkin and preparing to stand up, "I think it would be best if I just packed all those files, the USB drive, and the mortgage contracts into a box and brought them straight to Thomas Vance tomorrow morning. Let the lawyers sort out what is important and what isn't before we sign anything on Friday. Don't you agree?" "No!" Harrison practically shouted, surging forward in his chair before catching himself and dialing his panic back down to a strained, desperate plea. "No, Evelyn, that isn't necessary. Thomas is already overwhelmed with the probate filings. Legal fees will skyrocket if you dump a box of unverified documents on his desk." "Harrison is right," Victoria chimed in, her voice shrill and breathless. She gripped the edge of the marble table so tightly her knuckles turned white. "We are family, Evelyn. You should bring those documents directly to us. Let Harrison review them first. We can protect you from any unnecessary stress." "You are both so incredibly thoughtful," I smiled, the warmth in my voice entirely synthetic. I pushed my chair back and stood up, smoothing the front of my black dress. "But I really must be going. It has been a long, emotionally draining day, and I have 45 days of packing ahead of me after all." Neither of them moved to stop me. They were paralyzed, trapped in the gravitational pull of their own impending destruction. As I walked out of the formal dining room and made my way toward the private elevator, I could feel their terrified eyes burning into my back. I stepped into the elevator cab and pressed the button for the ground floor. Just as the heavy metal doors began to slide shut, I heard the sharp, frantic scraping of a chair being violently pushed back against the marble floor, followed immediately by Harrison's panicked, hushed voice swearing aggressively at his sister. The doors closed, sealing me in the quiet, descending box. I leaned against the polished steel wall and closed my eyes, a genuine, deeply satisfied smile finally touching my lips. The trap was not just set. The jaws had violently snapped shut. The real game had just begun. The humid night air of Charleston wrapped around me like a heavy, warm blanket, as I stepped out of the gleaming glass lobby of Victoria's penthouse building. The valet brought my understated sedan around, a sharp contrast to the aggressive luxury vehicles lining the circular driveway. As I slid into the leather driver's seat and closed the door, cutting off the ambient noise of the city, the silence inside the car felt electric. I had just dropped a lit match into a room full of gasoline, and the impending explosion was entirely out of my hands. Before I could even put the car into drive, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my purse. I expected it to be Harrison, calling in a blind panic to demand the USB drive or offer some ridiculous, transparent excuse for the $4.5 million mortgage I had casually mentioned. I pulled the phone out, ready to ignore it, but the number glowing on the screen was unfamiliar. It was a local South Carolina area code, but not a contact I recognized. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before swiping the screen to accept the call. "Evelyn," a woman's voice said. It was crisp, professional, and completely devoid of the synthetic warmth I had grown so accustomed to hearing from Richard's children. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm the managing partner at Jenkins and Associates. I believe you found the floor safe in the greenhouse tonight." My grip on the steering wheel tightened. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because your husband was a man of extraordinary precision," Sarah replied smoothly. "Richard hired me 7 months ago to draft his final estate documents and establish the offshore trust. He instructed me to monitor the digital access logs for the encrypted USB drive he left for you. The encryption software pinged my secure server the moment you successfully entered the password an hour ago. He said that once you saw the contents of that drive, you would need legal counsel that wasn't compromised by his children's social circles. We need to meet, Evelyn. First thing tomorrow morning." "Where?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "Not downtown," she said quickly. "My office is in West Ashley. It is out of the way, and Thomas Vance has absolutely no footprint out here. I will text you the address. Bring everything you found in the safe. The game Richard set up is in its final phase, and you need to understand exactly what kind of ammunition you are holding." The next morning, the drive over the Ashley River was painted in the soft pastel hues of a Carolina dawn. While Victoria and Harrison were likely pacing the floors of their expensive homes, sick with panic and sleep deprivation, I felt a profound sense of purpose. I pulled into the parking lot of a modest, unassuming brick building tucked between a local bakery and a hardware store. It was a stark, almost comical contrast to Thomas Vance's imposing, mahogany-lined suite in the historic district. There were no sweeping views of the harbor, no antique Persian rugs, and no receptionists offering sparkling water. Sarah Jenkins opened the door to her suite herself. She was a woman in her late 40s, dressed in a sharp, practical navy suit, her hair pulled back into a no-nonsense clasp. Her eyes were intelligent and assessing, immediately taking in the heavy canvas tote bag slung over my shoulder, which contained the black ledgers, the investigator's files, and the blue-bound will. "Come in, Evelyn," she said, stepping aside and leading me down a narrow hallway into an office that smelled of fresh coffee and old paper. The desk was a chaotic landscape of thick legal volumes and manila folders, the workspace of an attorney who actually did the grinding, unglamorous work of the law. I took a seat in a simple leather chair opposite her desk and began unloading the contents of my tote bag, placing the heavy documents between us. "Richard told me in his letter that he bypassed Thomas Vance. He said the properties are mortgaged to the hilt, and the offshore trust holds $6.2 million. Sarah nodded, pulling her own perfectly organized file from a locked drawer. "Everything Richard wrote in his final letter is the absolute legal truth. 7 months ago, when he realized his health was in terminal decline, he hired my firm specifically because we operate outside the elite social bubble of downtown Charleston. He needed someone invisible to Harrison's network. I was the one who executed the commercial mortgages on the Grand Charleston and the residential estate. We used out-of-state lending syndicates that require ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Thomas Vance has no idea those loans exist because they aren't recorded in the local channels he monitors for the family. So the trap is real, I whispered, the reality of it fully solidifying in the daylight. If they take the deeds to the hotel and the house, they instantly assume $4.5 million in commercial debt. Exactly, Sarah confirmed, her eyes sharp, and because those balloon payments are due in exactly 34 days, the lenders will initiate immediate foreclosure when Victoria and Harrison inevitably default. But the debt is only the civil side of the equation. That is the financial ruin Richard arranged. The items you found on that USB drive represent something much more dangerous. She pointed a pen at the sleek silver drive resting on top of the black ledgers. Richard's private investigators uncovered absolute proof of massive systemic fraud. Harrison's wealth management firm is a house of cards built on embezzled funds. He has been forging client signatures, altering fiduciary contracts, and moving stolen money across state lines into offshore shell companies to hide it from the IRS. $500,000, I said, reciting the number that had burned itself into my memory the night before. And growing, Sarah corrected grimly. That constitutes federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe tax evasion. And Victoria is no better. Her $400,000 debt isn't just a bad business loan. She secured that money from unregulated shadow lenders by using forged corporate guarantees, falsely claiming she had executive authority over the Grand Charleston's operating accounts. That is corporate fraud. Sarah leaned forward, resting her arms on the desk, her expression turning deadly serious. Evelyn, if you hand that USB drive and those black ledgers over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service, this stops being a family probate dispute. This becomes a federal criminal indictment. Victoria and Harrison won't just lose their country club memberships and their luxury cars. They will be indicted, prosecuted, and they will face significant time in a federal penitentiary. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Federal prison. I thought of Victoria's silk evening gowns and Harrison's tailored suits. I thought of their sheer arrogance, the way they had stood in the greenhouse and coldly calculated how quickly they could throw me out onto the street. They had believed they were untouchable, protected by their bloodline and their father's legacy. They had no idea that their father had spent his dying days meticulously gathering the evidence required to lock them in a cage. So where does that leave me? I asked, my voice calm. The trembling of the previous days entirely vanished. It leaves you holding a loaded gun to their heads, Sarah said bluntly. Richard designed this flawlessly. The blue bound will I am holding supersedes any document Thomas Vance has in his possession. You are the sole, uncontested heir to the entire estate. You hold the title to the mortgaged properties, you control the $6.2 million offshore trust, and you possess the criminal evidence. She reached across the desk and tapped the cover of the blue will. Richard gave you the ultimate power of execution. You can keep the properties, pay off the mortgages with your offshore funds, and hand the USB to the FBI, sending them both to prison. Or you can execute the gift clause. You can sign the Grand Charleston and the estate over to them, complete with the toxic $4.5 million debt, and let the commercial banks tear them to pieces in civil court while keeping the criminal evidence as leverage to ensure they never bother you again. I sat back in the chair, absorbing the absolute totality of my new position. For 18 years, I had been the outsider. I had been the woman they tolerated only because their father demanded it. In the 48 hours since Richard's death, they had tried to strip me of everything, reducing my life to a pitiful $150,000 payout and a crushing mountain of medical debt. They had wanted to leave me destitute. Now the power of life and death, of freedom and imprisonment, rested entirely in the palm of my hand. I was no longer the grieving, helpless widow, waiting for the gavel to fall. I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. As if sensing the shift in the universe, my cell phone began to vibrate in my purse. I pulled it out. It was a barrage of text messages from Harrison, his tone no longer demanding, but bordering on absolute hysteria. He was begging me to come to Thomas Vance's office immediately, pleading with me not to show the documents to anyone, promising that we could work everything out as a family. I looked up from the glowing screen and met Sarah's waiting gaze. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. "Sarah," I said, my voice ringing with a newfound, unshakable authority, "please draft the gift deeds for the Grand Charleston and the residential estate. We have a meeting to attend downtown, and I believe it is time to give my stepchildren exactly what they have been demanding." The drive from Sarah Jenkins' modest West Ashley office back to the historic district of downtown Charleston felt like a victory lap before the race had even officially concluded. My cell phone, resting in the center console of my sedan, had become a relentless beacon of Victoria and Harrison's unraveling sanity. It vibrated with a continuous, frantic rhythm, illuminating the plush interior of the car with a barrage of notifications. "Evelyn, please answer. We need to finalize the estate waivers this morning. The Preservation Society is threatening to intervene." Victoria's messages were a transparent blend of fabricated administrative emergencies and poorly concealed terror. Harrison's texts were even more aggressive, abandoning the polite veneer he usually maintained. "Evelyn, where are you? You cannot take those unverified documents to Thomas. It will freeze the probate and tie up your life insurance. Come to Broad Street now. We have the medical debt assumption papers ready for you to sign. Let us protect you from this." "Protect me?" The word echoed in the quiet cabin of my car, drawing a cold, sharp laugh from my throat. Just 48 hours ago, standing in the humid air of Richard's beloved greenhouse, they had practically ordered me out onto the street, using the crushing weight of a $250,000 medical debt to strip me of 18 years of my life. Now, terrified that I had stumbled upon the financial autopsies detailing their $400,000 and $500,000 frauds, they were begging to absorb that very same debt. They believed they were racing against the clock to steal a $3.5 million heritage hotel and a pristine estate before I realized what they were worth. They were entirely, hopelessly blind to the fact that the gold mine they were sprinting toward was actually a ticking $4.5 million time bomb. I parked my sedan in the private garage adjacent to Thomas Vance's prestigious law firm. Sarah Jenkins had agreed to follow me in her own vehicle, carrying the heavy briefcase that held the true, blue-bound, last will and testament, the Cayman Islands trust documents, and the meticulously drafted gift deeds we had just prepared. We walked together through the warm Carolina morning, the historic cobblestones, and the scent of salt water, entirely contrasting the toxic confrontation awaiting us on the second floor. When the polished mahogany doors of the elevator parted, the tension in the firm's reception area was instantly palpable. The receptionist, usually a picture of Southern hospitality, looked visibly rattled, her eyes darting toward the main conference room. "Mrs. Evelyn," she whispered, quickly standing up, "Mr. Vance is waiting for you. Victoria and Harrison have been here for over an hour. They are very eager to begin." "I can imagine," I murmured, adjusting the strap of my heavy canvas tote bag. Sarah gave me a brief, reassuring nod as we approached the heavy double doors of the conference room. I pushed them open, stepping into the expansive, sunlit space. The contrast between the elegant surroundings and the desperate occupants was stark. Thomas Vance sat at the head of the massive oak table, rubbing his temples, looking like a man who had entirely lost control of his own clients. But it was Victoria and Harrison who commanded my attention. The flawless, expensive armor they had worn at the penthouse dinner the night before had completely cracked. Victoria's usually pristine hair was slightly disheveled, and the dark circles under her eyes could not be hidden by her expensive concealer. She was gripping a porcelain coffee cup with white-knuckled intensity. Harrison was pacing the length of the Persian rug, his custom suit jacket discarded over a chair, his tie loosened. He was sweating, a thin sheen of moisture gleaming on his forehead. The moment I walked in, Harrison practically lunged toward the table, his eyes locking onto the canvas tote bag over my shoulder. "Evelyn," he breathed, a mixture of profound relief and manic urgency coloring his voice. "Thank God. We were beginning to worry that you had gotten lost, or that the stress of the paperwork had overwhelmed you." "I apologize for keeping you waiting," I said, my voice projecting the soft, compliant tone of the terrified widow they expected. I took a seat near the center of the table, deliberately placing the heavy tote bag on the polished oak surface with a soft, ominous thud. Both of their eyes snapped to the bag, tracking it like starving animals watching a piece of meat. Victoria forced a tight, brittle smile, pulling a thick stack of legal documents toward her. "There is no need to apologize, darling. We just want to get this over with, so you can begin your healing process. Thomas has prepared the transfer waivers exactly as we discussed. You signed over your administrative claims to the Grand Charleston and the residential estate, and Harrison and I will immediately sign the binding assumption of the $250,000 medical debt. You walk away free and clear with your life insurance completely intact." Thomas cleared his throat, looking between me and the two desperate heirs. "Evelyn, as your husband's longtime counsel, I must reiterate what I told you yesterday. I am deeply uncomfortable with this transaction. I advise you to take a few days to review the financial disclosures before executing a waiver of this magnitude." "Thomas, please," Harrison snapped, his voice sharp and aggressive. "Do not confuse her. Evelyn has already made her decision. She specifically requested this arrangement to avoid the stress of probate. We are honoring her wishes. We are functioning as a family." "Of course, Harrison," I said softly, looking down at my hands. I brought the box of files from the greenhouse safe as I mentioned last night. The USB drive, the black ledgers, the commercial loan documents. I thought perhaps Thomas should look at them before I sign anything, just to be absolutely sure I'm doing the right thing. I reached toward the zipper of the tote bag. "No!" Victoria practically screamed, surging halfway out of her chair before catching herself. She took a ragged breath, attempting to smooth her features into an expression of loving concern. "I mean, no, Evelyn, that is entirely unnecessary. Those are just old, outdated corporate audits. Dad was notoriously paranoid in his final months. He kept meticulous records of every minor transaction, every hypothetical loan scenario. It is all irrelevant now." "Irrelevant?" I repeated, feigning innocence. "But the document I saw mentioned a $4.5 million mortgage against the hotel." Harrison stepped closer, hovering over me, his desperation making him reckless. "Evelyn, listen to me carefully. Dad explored commercial refinancing options, but he never executed them. The properties are free and clear. If you hand a bag of unverified hypothetical financial models to Thomas right now, it triggers a mandatory legal discovery phase. The probate court will freeze everything. Your life insurance will be frozen. The medical debt collectors will drain your personal checking accounts by the end of the week. You will be ruined." He pointed a trembling finger at the waiver document sitting in front of Victoria. "Sign the papers, Evelyn. Give us the hotel and the estate, and let us absorb the risk. Hand over that tote bag to me, and I promise you will never have to think about a single corporate liability or medical bill again." They were practically vibrating with greed and terror. They were so blinded by their own impending federal fraud charges, so desperate to secure the $3.5 million asset they needed to pay off their illegal debts, that they were willing to say or do anything to stop me from opening that bag. They thought they were manipulating a clueless, traumatized old woman. They believed they were millimeters away from the greatest victory of their lives, snatching Richard's empire right out from under me. They were completely, utterly oblivious to the reality of the situation. They didn't know that the commercial mortgages were not hypothetical, but active, bleeding, and tied directly to the deeds they were begging me to sign. They didn't know about the $6.2 million sitting safely in my offshore account. And they certainly didn't know that the quiet woman sitting next to me, Sarah Jenkins, was holding the actual legally binding will that rendered Thomas Vance's paperwork entirely obsolete. I looked at Victoria's pale, terrified face. I looked at Harrison's sweat-drenched forehead. They were practically begging me to hand them the detonator to their own destruction. Well, I sighed, offering them a small, fragile smile as I pulled my hand away from the zipper of the tote bag. When you explain it like that, Harrison, it certainly does sound frightening. I suppose I should just trust you both. You are, after all, Richard's bloodline. The collective sigh of relief that rushed out of Victoria and Harrison was loud enough to echo in the large conference room. They believed they had won. They thought they had successfully contained the threat and secured their opulent future. They practically shoved the silver pen into my hand, their eyes burning with a greedy, triumphant fire. I took the pen, feeling its cool weight in my fingers, and prepared to show them exactly what it meant to inherit their father's true legacy. The heavy silver pen hovered just an inch above the signature line of the property transfer waiver. The 20th floor boardroom of Thomas Vance's law firm was bathed in the bright, unforgiving light of the Carolina morning, offering a sweeping, panoramic view of the Charleston harbor and the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean beyond. It was a room built to intimidate, designed for corporate titans to carve up empires. Across the massive oak table, Victoria and Harrison were practically vibrating with a greedy, desperate anticipation. Their eyes were locked onto the tip of the pen, holding their breath as they waited for me to sign away my 18 years of marriage, my dignity, and the $3.5 million heritage hotel they so desperately needed to save themselves from ruin. They thought the game was over. They thought they had successfully weaponized my grief, using the threat of a $250,000 medical debt to force a terrified widow into total surrender. Instead of lowering the pen to the paper, I set it down on the polished wood. The sharp, metallic click echoed through the silent boardroom like a gunshot. I slowly pulled my hand back and folded it over the other in my lap, sitting perfectly straight in the high-backed leather chair. On second thought, I said, my voice entirely devoid of the trembling compliance I had projected for the past 48 hours, I do not believe I will be signing these documents today, Harrison, or ever. Harrison's jaw actually dropped, a flash of pure, unadulterated panic breaking through his tailored facade. Evelyn, what are you doing? We agreed. You requested this. The medical debt is entirely irrelevant, a new voice interrupted. The woman sitting quietly in the chair beside me, whom Victoria and Harrison had likely dismissed as a paralegal or an administrative assistant, stood up. Sarah Jenkins did not possess the expensive, superficial polish of the Charleston elite, but the absolute authority radiating from her posture instantly commanded the room. She opened her leather briefcase and pulled out the thick, blue-bound document. My name is Sarah Jenkins, managing partner at Jenkins and Associates, she announced, her voice crisp and clinical. She tossed the blue-bound document across the table. It landed directly on top of the transfer waivers Thomas Vance had so carefully prepared. And those waivers you are trying to force my client to sign are legally void. Thomas, Richard fired your firm 7 months ago. He engaged my services to draft his true final estate documents because he knew someone in your office was leaking his financial strategies to his children. Thomas Vance physically recoiled, his face draining of all color as he stared at the blue cover. He reached out with a trembling hand, flipping open the document to the signature page, verifying the notary seals and Richard's unmistakable handwriting. This is impossible, Victoria hissed, surging to her feet, her hands planted flat on the oak table. Dad would never use a strip mall attorney. This is a forgery. You are trying to defraud the estate. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply reached over and pulled the heavy zipper of the canvas tote bag open. The harsh, metallic sound silenced Victoria instantly. I reached inside and pulled out the 3 black ledgers, dropping them onto the table. Next came the thick, heavily redacted reports from the Atlanta private investigators. And finally, I placed the sleek silver USB drive right in the center of the mahogany table, positioning it so the sunlight caught its metallic surface. "Sit down, Victoria," I commanded, the absolute certainty in my tone forcing her to drop slowly back into her chair, her eyes wide with mounting terror. I turned my gaze to Harrison, watching the sweat bead on his forehead, his tailored suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for his deflating posture. "Richard hired private investigators the moment he received his terminal cancer diagnosis. He spent his final months watching you both. He knew everything. $500,000, Harrison. That is the exact amount you have embezzled from your elderly wealth management clients. We have the forged signatures, the altered fiduciary contracts, and the routing numbers for the offshore shell companies you used to evade federal taxes." Harrison made a choked, pathetic sound, his hands trembling violently as he stared at the investigator reports. I turned back to Victoria, who was now gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles were stark white. "And $400,000 for you, Victoria. A massive, fraudulent deficit accumulated by funneling corporate funds into a phantom luxury startup, ultimately driving you into the arms of unregulated shadow lenders. You forged corporate guarantees using the Grand Charleston's name. That is not just bad business. That is federal wire fraud." The silence in the 20th floor boardroom was absolute, heavy with the crushing weight of their exposed crimes. Thomas Vance looked at the 2 heirs with an expression of profound disgust, realizing he had been manipulated into acting as an accomplice to a pair of desperate criminals. "You thought I was a naive, grieving old woman you could easily bully into the streets," I continued, my voice cold and steady. "You thought you were rushing me into surrendering an empire so you could liquidate it and save yourselves from federal prison. But Richard was 10 steps ahead of you." I reached into my purse and pulled out Richard's sealed letter and a new set of legal documents Sarah Jenkins had drafted that morning. A deed of gift. I placed the documents on the table, and right on top of them, I set a heavy antique brass key. It was the master key to the Grand Charleston. "This is what you wanted," I said, gesturing to the key. I watched their eyes dart toward it, still flickering with a dying ember of greedy hope. "You wanted the magnificent Grand Charleston. You wanted the sweeping Italian marble staircases. You wanted the prestige of the historic district. You wanted those breathtaking $1-million crystal chandeliers that hang in the ballroom like frozen rain. You wanted the visual masterpiece of your father's legacy because you believed you could sell that masterpiece to wipe your slates clean." I leaned forward, locking eyes with Harrison. "But it is a magnificent, glittering, empty shell. Knowing you were thieves, Richard aggressively mortgaged the hotel and the residential estate to commercial lending syndicates outside the state. He bled the properties dry. If you take this key and you take this deed, you do not inherit a $3.5 million asset. You instantly assume $4.5 million in high-interest commercial debt." The realization hit them like a physical blow. Victoria let out a sharp, breathless gasp, pressing her hand over her mouth. Harrison's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as the flawless trap Richard had engineered finally snapped shut around them. "The balloon payments are due in 34 days, I stated, delivering the final lethal strike. "You have no credit. You have no capital. You will default immediately. The banks will foreclose on the hotel, they will seize the residential estate, and they will tear your personal lives apart in civil court to collect the deficiency balance. It will bankrupt you both permanently." "He couldn't have," Harrison whispered, tears of absolute defeat welling in his eyes. "Where did the money go? The equity?" He couldn't have just burned it. He didn't burn it, Sarah Jenkins answered smoothly, stepping forward. He transferred $6.2 million in untraceable liquid cash into an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands, a trust that lists Evelyn as the sole, absolute beneficiary. She has the capital to pay off those mortgages right now if she chooses. You have absolutely nothing. I pushed the deed of gift and the brass key directly across the polished oak table, stopping them right in front of Victoria and Harrison. Here is your inheritance, I told them, my voice echoing in the grand boardroom. Richard left the ultimate decision to me, and I am giving you exactly what you demanded. You have two options. Option 1, you sign this deed of gift today. You take the keys, you take the crystal chandeliers, and you take the $4.5 million debt. You will lose the properties, and you will be utterly bankrupt, but you will remain free. I placed my hand flat on top of the silver USB drive. Option 2, you refuse my gift. I keep the hotel, I keep the estate, and Sarah walks out of this building, gets into her car, and hands this drive directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They will audit your firms by tomorrow morning, and you will both serve a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Victoria began to openly sob, the harsh, ugly sounds of a woman whose entire fraudulent existence had just been incinerated. Her expensive designer facade had completely melted away, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, cornered child. Harrison put his head down on the mahogany table, his shoulders shaking as the reality of his total destruction washed over him. They had tried to trap a widow, and instead they had walked straight into a meticulously designed execution chamber. There was no negotiation. There were no desperate pleas for family harmony. The evidence was irrefutable, and the threat of federal prison was an absolute paralyzer. With trembling, defeated hands, Harrison reached out and picked up the silver pen I had abandoned just minutes before. He did not bother to read the contract. He simply flipped to the last page, his tears spotting the heavy legal paper, and signed his name, legally chaining himself to a $4.5 million anchor. He slid the document to Victoria, who sobbed hysterically as she added her signature, sealing their financial doom. I picked up the executed deed of gift, the black ledgers, and the USB drive, carefully placing them back into my canvas tote bag. I did not look at them again. They were no longer my stepchildren, and they were no longer a threat. They were just two broken, bankrupt strangers sitting in a boardroom, entirely crushed beneath the weight of their own greed. I turned my back on them and walked out of the double doors, leaving the antique brass key to the magnificent doomed hotel sitting alone on the table. 5 months have passed since that fateful morning in the 20th floor boardroom of Thomas Vance's law firm. The news of what transpired in Charleston reached me through a series of clinically detached, highly satisfying emails from Sarah Jenkins. The spectacular, catastrophic collapse of Victoria and Harrison's lives played out exactly as Richard had meticulously engineered. It was not merely a financial downfall. It was a total, absolute obliteration of their entire world. Exactly 34 days after they had greedily, desperately signed the deed of gift, tethering their names to the toxic properties, the massive commercial balloon payments came due. Just as Richard and Sarah had predicted, they defaulted immediately. They simply did not possess the liquid capital to even cover the monthly interest, let alone the principal $4.5 million balance. The out-of-state lending syndicates, entirely unsympathetic to the prestigious family name and immune to the social pressures of Charleston high society, moved with ruthless, terrifying speed. Within weeks, heavy iron padlocks were placed on the grand, polished brass doors of the Grand Charleston. The magnificent Heritage Hotel, the $3.5 million crown jewel they had schemed and bullied to steal from a grieving widow, was seized and shuttered. The sprawling residential estate, the home where I had spent 18 years of my life, was similarly foreclosed upon and immediately prepped for a brutal, wholesale bank auction. But the loss of the real estate was only the beginning of their nightmare. Because the property sold at auction for significantly less than the inflated maximum leverage commercial mortgages Richard had secretly taken out, the banks aggressively pursued Victoria and Harrison for the massive deficiency balance. The civil lawsuits triggered an avalanche. The aggressive legal scrutiny exposed the fragile, fraudulent foundations of their personal finances. Victoria's unregulated shadow lenders in Atlanta saw the public foreclosure notices and panicked, calling in her $400,000 phantom startup debts all at once. Harrison's wealthy, elite clients, spooked by the sudden collapse of the family empire, demanded independent third-party audits of their portfolios. The house of cards did not just fall, it incinerated. Both Victoria and Harrison were forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in a desperate, ultimately futile attempt to shield themselves. They were utterly stripped of their wealth, their status, and their pride. Sarah informed me that Harrison had his wealth management license permanently revoked by the federal regulatory boards and was currently buried under a mountain of federal subpoenas regarding his tax evasion schemes. He was living in a cheap rented motel room on the outskirts of the city, awaiting potential criminal indictment. Victoria's sprawling, minimalist penthouse had been seized and sold by the bankruptcy courts to satisfy her aggressive creditors. She had been entirely exiled from the Charleston elite circles she once desperately clung to, her designer wardrobe auctioned off, her reputation permanently reduced to ashes. They were living in complete disgrace, crushed beneath the exact same ruthless greed they had tried to weaponize against me. While they were drowning in the dark, suffocating consequences of their own actions, I was breathing the clean, salty air of a profound new beginning. I had left the stifling humidity, the toxic memories, and the suffocating societal expectations of Charleston far behind me. Driving north along the coastline, I had found my sanctuary in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Using a fraction of the $6.2 million sitting safely in my offshore trust, I purchased a breathtaking custom-built coastal home in cash for exactly $1.8 million. It was a beautiful, sprawling wooden house with weathered cedar shingles that blended perfectly into the surrounding dunes and sea oats. Wraparound porches offered panoramic, unobstructed views of the wild, crashing Atlantic Ocean on one side and the calm, serene waters of the Sound on the other. It was a home filled with brilliant, natural sunlight, a stark and welcome contrast to the dark, heavy mahogany and perpetual twilight of Richard's old study. The house came with a massive, elevated deck and a small, resilient coastal garden that the previous owners had meticulously maintained. I spent my early mornings out there, a hot cup of coffee in my hands, breathing in the ocean mist and watching the pelicans dive into the surf. I planted hardy coastal flowers, finding a deep, grounding peace in the simple act of nurturing life in the sandy soil. It was satisfying work, entirely different from the 18 years I had spent carefully managing the fragile egos of Richard's ungrateful children and the exhausting expectations of his elite social circle. For the first time in my entire adult life, I was completely free. I was accountable to absolutely no one but myself. I took long, solitary walks along the empty stretches of beach. I read thick novels on my sun-drenched porch. And I slept soundly through the night, the rhythmic crashing of the waves washing away the lingering shadows of my past. However, as the months passed and my soul began to heal, I realized that the financial fortress Richard had built for me was too massive to be used solely for my own comfort. I frequently thought back to that terrifying afternoon in the greenhouse. I remembered the paralyzing, suffocating fear of being a grieving widow, staring down a fabricated $250,000 medical debt, completely isolated and utterly convinced that I was powerless against the ruthless manipulation of my own family members. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was not the only older woman who had been targeted by greedy, entitled heirs. I knew there were countless other seniors out there being bullied, intimidated, and financially abused by the very people who were supposed to love and protect them. Working closely with Sarah Jenkins, whose brilliant legal mind and unwavering loyalty had saved my life, I utilized a significant portion of my remaining offshore funds to establish a powerful, aggressive legal charity. We named it the Richard Legacy Foundation for Financial Justice. The foundation was specifically designed to provide elite, pro bono legal counsel, forensic accounting services, and immediate financial intervention for elderly individuals facing severe financial abuse and manipulation from their own family members. We hired a team of ruthless, dedicated attorneys who specialized in tearing apart fraudulent wills, exposing predatory family members, and shielding vulnerable widows and widowers from the exact type of extortion Victoria and Harrison had attempted. It was a beautiful, poetic continuation of Richard's final masterpiece. He had used his brilliant financial mind to build a shield that saved my life, and now I was expanding that shield to protect hundreds of others. It was not the inheritance Victoria and Harrison had ever envisioned, but it was exactly the legacy Richard would have been incredibly proud to leave behind. I had taken the worst moment of my life, the moment I was supposed to be destroyed, and forged it into an unbreakable weapon for justice. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below so I can see how far my story has reached. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until the end.